Welcome to Greenable Woodbridge. I'm your host, Carolyn Ehrlich, and today we're talking about a topic that is both reactive and proactive. It's reactive because it's a reaction to the flooding that we have constantly, unfortunately, throughout the town, and storms like Superstorm Sandy. It's proactive because we actually are trying to do things to be able to cope and maybe solve some of these problems a little bit. So I have with us today two experts. One expert is in-house. Tom Flynn is our certified flood manager, if you can believe. Yes, Woodbridge does have a certified flood manager. And our other guest is Dr. Joe DiLorenzo, who is a senior scientist, although we have retitled him a super senior scientist at Nigerian, and we very fondly call him Dr. Joe. So welcome. And I think we should start off by both of you simply telling us a little bit about yourselves and how you got involved in this area of water resources and climate resiliency and that mixed bag that's becoming so important.
Sure. So, I got involved in this field, I guess about 10 years ago already, which is very surprising. But I started to become more involved as a natural scientist. So preserving natural floodplain functions was what got me involved in floodplain management. And then as I started to dive down that wormhole, I started to really come at it from a few different angles. So it became more about protecting people, protecting the resources, protecting people from the vulnerability, the asset management side of it, and then it became more about explaining it and explaining the risks and trying to help people better understand that you don't need a hurricane to have flood damage. FEMA actually says that 26% of flood claims come from those outside of special flood hazard areas.
Interesting.
So, what I love to do and what brought me closer to the work is to help educate folks and to also make wise decisions in these sensitive natural areas, right? Because there are times where it makes sense to rebuild, right? And then there's times to preserve and times to restore. So, that's kind of what brought me full circle in floodplain management.
Great. And I know you have a story from your childhood that kind of triggered this interest. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. So, we were actually just talking before we sat down, and I actually thought it was a hurricane, but it turns out, Dr. Joe pointed out, it wasn't. I was quite young at the time, early in childhood, and it was a nor'easter. So again, you don't need a hurricane. Mm-hmm. But there was a section of town here in Woodbridge that flooded very badly at the time, and I'll never forget rescuing an aunt of mine from the top of an apron of a home. So these things happen, unfortunately, and we're trying to do our best to mitigate that damage, mm-hmm. To help increase the awareness of the issues, and that we have over 3,000 acres of floodplain. 7 out of our 10 towns have special flood hazard areas.
That's a scary number. It really is.
And it makes for a hard job for us, but for mm-hmm. a very important job. So we take it very seriously. Just as serious as we want to take the recreational side of it, right? We want mm-hmm. people to be able to enjoy these areas, like in Seawarren and our boating areas, and go for hikes in the Oros Preserve. But at the same time, there are risks involved. Cars can float in only 2 feet of moving water, mm-hmm. And it's important to remember these things.
Correct. And Dr. Joe, how did you get involved?
Well, I was fortunate enough to live by the coast my whole life and work by the coast, and so I was always attracted to that, like many people. I don't have any heroic stories like Tom, but again, as we were saying before we started, at an early age, I saw what a hurricane can do. I saw Hurricane Donna back in the 1960, mm-hmm. and I saw its effects in my neighborhood, and I saw that it wasn't until Superstorm Sandy that we had a storm that exceeded that. In fact, exceeded it by 3 or 4 feet in flood levels. And so, often you hear people say in neighborhoods, I don't need flood insurance. Yes, I'm near the river, but it hasn't flooded here since I've lived here for 20 years. Well, sometimes it could be more than that.
Right.
It could take 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, but a really intense storm can damage your property. And to protect yourself, it's wise to get a preferred policy from the flood insurance people at FEMA to protect your assets.
People call town hall and they go, we never flooded before. And so the town must have done something to cause that flooding. But that's not the case at all. Explain how that could happen.
Well, when certain things align, for example, in the case of Superstorm Sandy, you had a number of worst case possible conditions. Woodbridge Township is affected primarily with coastal flooding by nor'easters. Hurricanes could happen. If you're in the path of the eye of a hurricane, it certainly could be worse than anything, but fortunately that hasn't happened in modern history. Nor'easters, however, are broad systems that pile up water along the entire coast. You can't miss them when they happen, when severe ones happen. In the case of Superstorm Sandy, you had a tropical storm that turned into a nor'easter at the end of this tropical storm season. And it made a left-hand turn during a full moon cycle. Everything that could have gone wrong happened.
Went wrong, right.
So it's highly unlikely that happens, but it can happen, and it could happen again. And so you have to protect yourself.
That is great. So you are busy working on floodplain management and how to manage our water resources. What are you doing on that end, and how do you make a floodplain map?
Sure. So, like Dr. Joe said, right? So these storms can happen in back-to-back years. They could happen in the same year, right? So it's important to realize that when you hear the 100-year flood, it's a horrible term, and we do our best as CFMs to educate folks on that. It's a 1% annual chance exceedance probability, which is a very fancy way of saying that there's a 1% chance that this can occur. And what this is the special flood hazard area as defined by FEMA. So really what that is, Carol, like you said, what a flood map is a highly studied area by FEMA, so by the federal government, and basically it looks at everything from conveyance to depth to overland effects, top of bank elevations, the way in which the water can move at a given time, right? So the hydrology, the hydraulics, distribution of water, the movement of water, all these things come into play to create these maps, right? And essentially what we do our best job at is trying to look at what these maps mean on a human level, right? And how we can manage what FEMA is telling us to expect.
So, Dr. Joe, whenever you come in for a meeting and we're discussing these maps with the mayor, he always gets all excited. He says, we're going to talk about the WOFUS. And that's like his favorite word in the whole world. So what is a WOFUS?
Well, one of the tools that FEMA uses to create the maps is a model that simulates the attenuation of water waves when they go over land. So picture this. You have a coastal area. You have a severe storm. The waves are coming, lapping along the coast. They come inland. They come over land. And that's the model that determines the height of the wave on top of the storm surge. That determines what's called the base flood elevation, the 1% elevation that defines the special flood hazard area on the map. And so, that's one of the important tools that FEMA uses.
And it's really not a laughing matter.
It's not a laughing matter because
serious.
Waves can be destructive.
Very.
And, if you have a wave that's more than, say, a foot and a half high, it could cause severe damage in a building. And so it's something that's in the design standards.
Right. And with storm surges, that's a major concern.
Yeah.
So this is a new word that I learned since I've been doing this with Tom. There are two types of flooding. There's the tidal and the fluvial, correct?
Correct.
So do you want to explain that and what the differences are?
Sure. So to that point, right? So within special flood hazard areas, you have these zones, right? So there's an A zone in town. There's an AE zone, a coastal A zone, and a VE zone. The VE and the coastal A are indicative of coastal conditions, of wave hazards, like Dr. Joe had mentioned. So that's your tidal areas. Our fluvial areas in town essentially carry rainwater, right? So we have 7 sub-watersheds within the township, so we have a lot of drainage, a lot of different areas where, as Dr. Joe said, the rainwater itself poses another threat in relation to your tidal storms. So that's really the biggest difference is, you're either looking at a coastal condition or you're looking at more of an inland possible snow melt, ice jams, anything that really is watery.
Yeah. And that's a case where people will say, I never flooded before,
right.
And now I am. Because you can never, fluvials, they vary.
Right.
They're very,
right. So
very
that's like areas of Colonia, so
yes.
the Pumpkin Patch Brook area, the south branch of the Rahway River.
I saw engineering out there today cleaning that. So that's important.
Excellent.
That kind of segues into what are the things that we can do when I talked about being proactive?
Sure.
What are some of the things that we can do probably more with fluvial than with tidal? Tidal's a lot more extreme, what you have to do. So let's start with the fluvial and then we'll go to tidal.
Sure. So for one, on a personal level, right, what folks can always do is call the engineering department and have a formal floodplain designation for their property and their structure. So you can also visit our engineering webpage, and there's a flood viewer on our floodplain management website. So that's on the personal level to protect their property, protect themselves from hazards. But then, there's certainly other things, right? So like Dr. Joe mentioned, there's this preferred risk policy through FEMA. If you're not within a special flood hazard area, it could be as cheap as $100 a year or so to purchase. Those are just some basic things. You should always keep a go bag. Never drive down flooded waterways or any roadway that when you can't judge and see the road. It's never a good idea to drive down. So there's these personal things that you can do, right, to just kind of ready yourself for any kind of situation. Joe, you want to talk a little bit about
Yeah, well, just to follow up on that, it's amazing how many people challenge these flooded roadways this day and age.
Yeah.
What people should really do is find alternate routes. So if you don't want to get out of your car and test the waters, the best thing to do is to know alternate routes to get to your destination where it doesn't flood. Right. You have a lot of information. You have FEMA flood maps to identify the flood hazard areas. You have Google Maps, you have plenty other resources to determine an alternate route to get to your destination. So, as they say at FEMA, turn around, don't drown, and use that alternate route.
Right.
Yeah, but Woodbridge is a challenge to mitigate stormwater, what we call stormwater runoff impacts. And do you think, if your audience knows what that is, basically the drainage area that conveys the flows to the streams of Woodbridge has a lot of impervious cover. So when it rains, the rain can infiltrate in a lot of the areas that are in Woodbridge, and so it runs off on the surface or shallow subsurface. It's a real problem. It's an older town. It's the oldest town. And so it's a challenge because you don't have a lot of open space to mitigate the impacts. You can't build rain gardens all over town.
We're trying.
We're trying. It's a challenge. You can't build, detention wetlands or other, other detention basins and other possible ways of reducing the peak flood flows. And so Woodbridge is really difficult place, but through CRS, through planning, we're going to talk about a watershed management plan later. There are things you could do to try to mitigate it.
Okay, you just said CRS, and I think only the three of us know what that means. So, Tom, do you want to say what CRS is?
Sure. So, The National Flood Insurance Program is mandatory to participate in, so the town was already participating in that. However, we took it a step further, and we started to put together an application to FEMA's Community Rating System, which is the CRS program. That's a voluntary program, and it recognizes the actions that you're doing at a local level. And basically, FEMA says, you know, what you're doing is so important and so good for the community that we're going to discount flood insurance to a specific degree. So there's actions that we put forward that we felt that we were doing and started to implement as a result of the CRS application. And we just found out as of May 1st that we're in as a Class 6. So it goes from a Class 10, you're out of the CRS in a Class 10, up to a Class 1. We're in as a Class 6, and that correlates to a 20% reduction on flood insurance.
And people just got their insurance bills, so they were very surprised and happy, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, there's things that we do to, you know, maintain that class certification. But there's other projects, right, that we're trying to move forward and increase our floodplain management program locally, which will then correlate, you know, hopefully to raising that class and lowering the insurance. So Dr. Joe mentioned one of those things, which is a watershed master plan. So I'll let Dr. Joe take it from here. But, you know, that's just one element, right, of so many other things that we're doing. So it's just important to note that. You know, and a lot of it are things that we are doing already, but it's just ensuring that planning mechanism is in place.
Yeah, and Pat, regarding that watershed master plan, the town already has a master plan.
Right.
The town already has a stormwater management plan as an element of the master plan and a stormwater pollution protection plan. Right. So what's different about the FEMA CRS watershed master plan is that it's based directly on a rainfall runoff model. So whereas those other plans are more qualitative and descriptive, this is going to be something based on a modeling tool that will relate the amount of stormwater runoff that's generated, and will calculate the timing and the volume of peak flood flows.
Oh my God.
So you'll be able to, for different watersheds of streams that pass through Woodbridge, you'll be able to get a good handle on basically what's controlling the fluvial flooding throughout town.
Very interesting.
So
it's scientific. It's, you know, the other plans are more
descriptive
and everything, but this is really based on science.
Yeah, and you know, it'll have the modeling component, but it'll also have other components. It'll have an analysis of the impacts of present developed areas, future developed areas cumulatively. So whereas you might look at a project now on a project-by-project basis, now you can get the big picture. You'll have a holistic tool, so you can make more informed decisions about future projects in the town. And you can also look at schemes to mitigate current conditions and alleviate or prevent future flooding, and also preserve your open spaces and marshes.
Wow. So that's going to be a very helpful plan.
Yeah,
that's like just unbelievable.
And it complements what you have already.
Right,
so.
Right, it'll fit right in. And I know one of the things that you sit in on our redevelopment meetings, and one of the things that we're very, very strict now is about stormwater management plans.
Certainly.
You can't just build something and then let it flow down to the neighbors. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, you know, we're very cognizant of the fact that, you know, there's areas in town that are poised for redevelopment, and as part of that redevelopment, it's not just a facelift, right? It's a total analysis of the area and of the site conditions, and we don't want to create a problem for the future. We want to ensure that we're, you know, doing the right thing for the community, for the resilience factor, and for the environmental conditions, right? Because stormwater ultimately carries out to our bays and our oceans. So as part of that, you know, we want to be really cognizant and really aware of what we're doing, and we're not just, like you said, Carol, allowing folks to play by the old rules.
No, the old rules are totally gone.
Right.
So when you build a warehouse now, it used to be the developer would want to use every square inch for that warehouse so that they could make the money they make by square foot.
Right.
But now they have to take a huge piece of their land and do retention or detention basins, and I just don't think people are aware of it, and they think all of this development is hurting them. But in some cases, it might be containing retention or detention of the floodwaters for the neighbors around it.
Right.
So it might be improving it.
Absolutely. Yep.
So that's all good news. So let's talk a little bit about the title. We've done some Blue Acres.
Sure.
What we're doing out there, restoring the wetlands. Talk about that a bit.
Sure. So the Blue Acres program, for those that aren't aware, is essentially a state program. So the New Jersey State DEP runs the Blue Acres program, and they offer pre-storm value for homeowners that in order to get them out of harm's way and to prevent reoccurring flood losses. After Superstorm Sandy, we've had about 120 to 130 structures out of the most vulnerable portions of our tidal floodplains, which was great for those families. They're out of harm's way. And we've taken it a step further, and we've worked with Rutgers and Dr. Brooke Maslow on just incredible floodplain restoration work that
it actually looks beautiful out there, aside from being practical.
Yes, it's great for flood storage capacity. It's great for the environmental benefits associated with that, and ecosystem services down the line when folks can actually get out there and enjoy nature and the wise decision making that we're doing to ensure that there won't be continued vulnerability over time is just excellent.
So, so the CRS system is a rating system, and you have to do certain things, and you have to accumulate all of the points. And one of the things you need to do, one of the biggest things you actually need to do is public education, which this show is part of that. We just sent out letters explaining to people what they should do for flooding, et cetera, et cetera. So what are some other things that you want to get out there to the public on behalf of yourself and FEMA?
Sure. We would definitely always say to just make sure that if you decide to rebuild responsibly. Building permits are always required, and we always stress that. But freeboard is essentially building 1 foot above what Dr. Joe mentioned earlier is the base flood elevation. Mm-hmm. We always encourage, if you'd like to go more than 1 foot, that is certainly a factor of safety that is encouraged. Aside from that, there's just other things to just always be aware of, right? The preservation of natural floodplain functions is just critical to ensuring that these nearshore habitats remain aesthetically pleasing. That we do the right thing for biodiversity, and folks can continue to enjoy them for years to come. So we talked a lot about vulnerability and risk and ensuring that you're always prepared. It can never hurt to just make sure that you know what to do with pets too. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, you got to just get up and go, and unfortunately, the pets get left behind sometimes. So it's important to, take care of the little furry friends.
Absolutely. So another thing that you and Mike Gillen, our engineer, are working on is what are we calling them? The dangerous sites, or
right?
So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So Dr. Joe mentioned, we're 350 years old. We're an old town, and there's drainage issues that that the town is certainly aware of, right? So like you said, Carolyn, we get calls after significant storm events. We had 4 inches of rain in July. Parts of Main Street flooded out. It's just when you get that intensity of rainfall, and there's no ability for the ground to absorb it, we have to look at these areas where we know that there's going to be a conveyance choke point, right? So we have these really neat GIS systems where we can go in and kind of point them out and assess them and go out before storms and after storms, and we look at just to make sure that everything is as clear as possible, and we're managing the system, right? Because unfortunately, we're not going to spend millions of dollars each year to fix each of these sites, but the good thing is, they're on our radar, and we are trying to do our best to manage them in their current condition, but also take the next step down the line and say, listen, these are things that we're aware of, and we're going to start to fix them over time, like in the redevelopment areas, and as projects come to make the most sense of when to fix them and how to fix them, rather than just, go in and put Band-Aids on things.
That is terrific. There was a time, like 10 years ago, when I first started Greenable Woodbridge, we didn't really talk about climate or flooding, and it's so refreshing now that people get it, and they understand that they're the ones that can help us make a difference.
Absolutely.
So we have like 2 more minutes left. So I'd like to have, if you have something you'd like to conclude with, closing remarks. Dr. Joe?
Maybe just an observation, and I alluded to this before, but for example, with Hurricane Harvey, FEMA found that about 40% of the flood areas damaged were not special flood hazard areas. If we are indeed getting more intense rainstorms, people in developed areas that never flooded before really have to be vigilant and understand that they could now flood. In fact, you've had some locally, Main Street, I understand, that recently flooded that never flooded before.
And in Fords, they had a considerable amount of flooding, never
so
flooded
this is a trend to watch, because we're getting these intense rainstorms, and if the infrastructure is old and it doesn't have the capacity to drain those areas, they're going to flood. So that's just a...
Tom?
Right. Yeah. So it's about resilience, right? And one of the hardest things for us as CFMs is to define the word resilience, which folks ask us to do so often. But it's the ability to rebound quicker, right? So by all the projects we're doing is essentially to try to meet that end. These areas where we know that have been significantly vulnerable over time are now being restored to natural floodplains. That's resilient. The homeowners that stay or that build in floodplains are now building to a higher standard. We're looking at our drainage areas. We're looking at these projects to just have a better sense of what to do next, right? So it's these new solutions to old problems, right? And it's just to try to get at a better end of resilience.
That's terrific. And one closing note that I think is almost on the fun side. Our high school students have been doing paintings by, explain that real quickly.
Sure,
we have
really
like
quick.
30 seconds left.
Sure. So the Paint the Drain project was this summer. Some students from JFK painted some fish and otters near a storm drain on Main Street to just show that stormwater drains to our bays and our oceans, and we need to be cognizant of that.
So don't change your oil in your driveway
Absolutely
because
not.
That's going into the ocean,
Right.
and that is not a good thing.
Right.
And so if you're on Main Street, go by Biddings. I'm going to do a little advertisement for Biddings now. Go to the restaurant and look at the drain outside of it, because it's just great and it's part of our message.
Absolutely.
And it's important. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. This was very
Thanks for
interesting. I
having us.
learned a
Yeah,
lot.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for watching Greenable Woodbridge and being part of the change and part of the excitement.